You never realize the value of silence until your voice has been spoken over one too many times. That apartment, the one with the bay windows and crooked hardwood floors that shimmered like sunlight spilling across pages of an unwritten book, it wasn't just mine. It was me. Every chipped tile in the bathroom, every late-night meal reheated on tired legs after double shifts. It all told the story of a woman clawing her way out of invisibility. My name is Olivia Jensen, and the day I disappeared wasn't dramatic. It wasn't impulsive. It was precise. Surgical ihi, one minus he, terrorist yarns. The culmination of years spent being everyone's fallback plan. Everyone's safe landing, except my own. I had spent 5 years saving for that place. A 5-year stretch of coffee spoons and coupon dinners. 5 winters without heat above 60 degrees. Summers without AC. I built that home the way men once built railroads, brick by mental brick. Powered by exhaustion and an unshakable belief that one day I would arrive and it would be mine. But when you grow up as the quiet one, the reliable one, the family accountant of emotions, your boundaries aren't fences. They're suggestions. Your space isn't sacred, it's communal. And your dreams, they're often overwritten by louder mouths and shinier needs. It started with a dinner, a Sunday roast that tasted like every other family dinner, perfectly seasoned with passive expectations, and the unspoken rule that love looks like sacrifice. We sat around that table, my parents at either end, like ruling monarchs of the kingdom of compromise. Rachel, my older sister. The family's fragile masterpiece sat diagonally across from me, sipping wine she didn't buy, wearing forgiveness like it was her birthright. I had just finished updating them on a recent project at work. Nothing flashy, just progress. Steady, earned. That's when my father cleared his throat, that godlike signal that the real conversation was about to begin. And we've worked it out. He said, slicing roast beef like it was strategy. Rachel will stay in your apartment for a few months, just until she gets on her feet. As if they were granting her my heir. As if my name on the lease was decorative. I didn't raise my voice. That would have been out of character, and that's the thing about characters. Families like to cast them. Rehearse them, keep them in line. I was always the good daughter, the one who doesn't cause scenes, the one who understands. But that night, as the clatter of silverware went silent around their announcement, something cracked beneath the surface of my understanding. Because that apartment wasn't a luxury, it was my line in the sand. My declaration, my cathedral of self-respect, in a world that never once offered me permission to build one. I nodded. I sipped wine. I played along. But inside, I was rewriting everything. See, every family has an invisible script. The unspoken expectations handed to you like heirlooms. For some, it's to be the golden child. For others, the rebel. I was handed the role of the bridge the fixer between extremes. A middle child buried between a sister who collapsed into drama and a brother who floated through life without accountability. I was the scaffolding, the structure that held everyone up, but no one ever asks the scaffolding how it feels. They expect you to bend, to carry, to never rust, to disappear when the house is done. When I signed the lease for that apartment 2 years ago, I cried for hours, not because I was overwhelmed, but because, for once, no one had a say. Not my mother, who'd always treated my independence like a phase. Not my father, who weighed my decisions like they were stocks in a failing market. And certainly not Rachel, who treated her life like a canvas. We were all obligated to repaint every time she smudged the lines. The morning light in that place didn't just pour in. It blessed me. It lit up the exposed brick in warm golds, reminding me that despite every unpaid internship, every roommate who forgot to pay utilities, and every corporate ladder built of glass, I had made something real. And they wanted to give it away, like a hand-me-down sweater. Not once did they ask. Not once did they consider whether I had plans, privacy, or even an opinion. They spoke as if I was a guest in my own story. A character written into their plot twist without consent. But that night, after I drove home in silence, past the same lamplit streets I used to walk when I couldn't afford gas, I realized something. They didn't see me. Not really. They saw a placeholder, a utility, a convenience, and that was going to change. I poured a glass of water and sat on the floor of my office, the very room my sister planned to transform into a creative space. I ran my hand along the spines of books I'd collected, the blueprints of dreams nobody bothered to ask about. And then I opened my laptop, not to write an email, but to write a Declaration of Independence, one clause at a time. Not with anger, not with fire, but with precision. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one who yells, it's the one who watches and prepares. You don't fight narcissism with noise. You fight it with boundaries so firm they echo louder than any accusation. I reviewed my lease. I reviewed my rights. And in that quiet moment of strategic clarity, I remembered a quote from Lincoln, a man who bore the weight of a divided house. The best way to destroy an enemy is to make him a friend. But not every enemy wears a uniform. Some wear aprons, some call you sweetheart, and sometimes it isn't about destroying them. It's about rescuing yourself from the slow death of being agreeable. My parents had made the same mistake so many others do, assuming that silence equals compliance, that polite smiles mean peace, that just because someone can be leaned on, they mistook grace for weakness. But I didn't correct them. I just started to disappear. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. There's a particular freedom that comes with quiet rebellion, the kind that doesn't announce itself with fireworks, but with unreturned calls and unanswered texts. It's the kind of freedom Rosa Parks exercised when she refused to stand. It's the kind of freedom Walt Disney practiced when he was told he lacked imagination. And it's the kind I was claiming not for vengeance, but for victory. The plan was simple. Let them plan their move. Let them organize furniture deliveries and lease assumptions like monarchs assigning property to the noble class. And on the morning of the move, let them arrive to an empty throne. I wasn't running away. I was walking straight and deliberate out of their shadow. And the beauty of it, they'd have to face not just the locked door, but the echo of their own entitlement ringing through a hallway I no longer lived in. Because when you spend your life being everyone's safety net, the loudest protest isn't rage, it's absence. And so I disappeared not to vanish, but to be seen for the first time. The thing about quiet departures is that they echo louder than slammed doors. In the days that followed that family dinner, I became fluent in a language I had never been taught, the language of silent refusal. Not spiteful, not loud, just firm, just final. I answered their messages with curated vagueness, smiled when necessary, nodded when expected. But inside, I was already packing. Not just my things, my power. I stopped asking for permission, stopped justifying my time. And in the dead quiet of the evenings that followed, I wrote my plan with the kind of precision they never expected from me, because control was their native tongue. But restraint was mine. I remember setting up a meeting with Tanya, the building manager. Her eyes scanned the sublease paperwork I had filled out for Derek, a quiet, respectful colleague from my firm whose condo had just suffered a catastrophic pipe burst. "Everything looks good," she said, stamping the forms with the finality of law. "He can move in this weekend. You'll retain primary lease, but he's authorized for the unit. Any issues? He'll deal with security." I nodded, and in that moment, the contract wasn't just about occupancy, it was about sovereignty. I was finally putting legal weight behind the boundaries I had only ever whispered before. By Tuesday, my mother began texting more frequently under the guise of planning logistics, but really, to test the walls of the cage. "Could you send over the building code for the garage? Rachel wants to know if her bookshelf will fit in the elevator." No mention of asking permission, no acknowledgement of assumption. I replied with a soft deferral. "I'm working late. We'll send info later this week." But I wouldn't. Not because I was cruel, but because I was done being complicit in my own erasure. Every time I walked through that apartment, I touched my memories like relics. The chipped edge of the counter where I'd dropped my phone in a panic during my first Zoom interview. The faded spot on the windowsill where my houseplants leaned for light during months of burnout and recovery. They weren't just furniture. They were the physical imprint of survival. And they would not become collateral in someone else's recovery arc. Not again. Wednesday came. And with it, a group text from Rachel. "Movers booked for Saturday. So excited for sister bonding time." Sister bonding. She'd once left me stranded outside a party in college because her ex had shown up and she'd left without telling anyone. I waited in the cold for 2 hours, called our parents. They blamed me for not sticking with the group. That was the night I realized being right in my family meant nothing. What mattered was being convenient. And I had played that part with Oscar-winning grace until now, Thursday night. I visited my storage unit, quiet little space on the edge of downtown, just big enough for a few valuables, irreplaceable journals, and documents that no sister should ever be sorting through on a hunt for drawer space. The air in that concrete box was stale and sharp with silence, but I breathed it like freedom, because every item I locked in there was a declaration. This is mine. This is sacred. This is not up for discussion. Friday, Derek came by to pick up the keys. I showed him around where the breaker was, how to reset the router if it glitched, which drawer held extra light bulbs. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry. He just nodded, looked me in the eye, and said, "I've got it. They won't get past me." Not in a protective hero way, in the way comrades speak before a battle. He'd gone through his own family estrangement after his divorce. He knew the look of someone who was no longer begging for understanding, but building their own fort from scratch. And with that, I left. Not with a bang, but with a door that clicked softly behind me, like the closing of a book that had overstayed its welcome on the shelf. The hotel I booked was only 30 minutes from my apartment, close enough to monitor, far enough to be unreachable. It overlooked the sea, where morning fog rolled in like fresh linen, and the gulls sounded less like chaos, more like prophecy. That Saturday morning, I didn't check my phone until the sun had risen, and when I did, they had arrived. The security app pinged at 10. So you went the session, sharp motion detected. I opened the feed. There they were. My mother cardigan pristine, clipboard in hand, like she was planning a bake sale. My father's sunglasses, jaw tight, ready to take control of a space he didn't own. Rachel, standing off to the side with a bored expression that said, "Of course this is happening. It always works out for me." They knocked. They rang. They called. Derek never opened the door. Instead, the building's weekend security staff came up after 5 minutes of escalation. On camera, I watched as my parents gestured wildly, my mother pulling out papers like they meant something. The officer pointed to the camera. Derek stepped out calmly, sublease in hand. No shouting. No spectacle. Just facts. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't have to scream. It just has to stand. My mother clutched her chest like a Shakespearean widow. My father's jaw clenched like steel. And Rachel did what she always did when reality failed to bend. She sulked, furious and disbelieving that anyone had dared to erect a line she couldn't cross. I watched them leave, trailed by Entitlement dragging its broken suitcase. They had come for a conquest. They left empty-handed. And me, I sat there, quiet, still, watching the tide pull in, not smiling. Not gloating, just breathing. For once, no one was knocking. No one was deciding what was mine. I sipped my coffee, and I remembered something Thomas Edison once said. "I have not failed. I've just found 10. 0 ways that won't work." That's what family had been to me. 0 ways to abandon myself in service of keeping peace. But this was my filament. My first glow. When they couldn't get in, they did the only thing they knew how to do. They escalated. I didn't respond to the calls. I didn't answer the texts. I let the voicemails pile up like the unread chapters of a book I had finally stopped rereading. It wasn't rebellion. It was clarity. I wasn't ignoring them out of cruelty. I was preserving the silence that had cost me years to earn. Because when someone decides to speak for you to plan your life, assign your space, write your role, the most revolutionary thing you can do is not explain your refusal. Because explanations, they're invitations. Invitations to be argued with. Reasoned against, worn down. And I was no longer in the business of being reasoned with. I was in the business of being whole. That Sunday night, I stood by the window of my hotel room and stared out at the ocean's horizon, thinking about how every woman I've ever admired learned the art of disappearing before she ever learned the art of being seen. Maya Angelou was once mute for 5 years after a trauma, not because she had nothing to say, but because the world didn't yet know how to hear her. Harriet Tubman vanished into the shadows of forests, railroads, and code not to escape, but to deliver herself and others into light. Sometimes disappearing isn't about vanishing. It's about realigning with your power. Monday morning, I checked in with Derek. He answered calmly, sipping coffee by the bay window that once reflected my 6A. Ambitions and midnight breakdowns. All good. He said, "They haven't come back. I've got eyes on the place. I'm reading your books. Hope you don't mind." I didn't. In fact, it was fitting, because Derek respected the story, the sacredness of a space someone bled for. He was merely holding it, not stealing it. Not renaming it. Just honoring it. Meanwhile, back on my phone, the family continued spinning. A message from my father. "This isn't acceptable. We're contacting building management to override this nonsense. Be an adult." My mother had taken a softer tone. "Rachel's very emotional. You're her sister. This isn't you. Olivia, please call." And Rachel had sent me a photo of her things in the back of a moving truck. "You're really doing this over an apartment. I have nowhere else to go." No mention of asking. No hint of apology. Just a familiar tool. Guilt. But here's the truth. No one tells you when you start enforcing boundaries. At first, it feels like cruelty, because you've been trained to equate self-respect with selfishness. But self-respect doesn't scream. It doesn't throw things. It just locks the door and moves the key inside your own palm. I spent the next few days walking by the water, thinking, not plotting, not retaliating, just feeling the full weight of what it meant to finally stand outside the role they had cast for me. Because sometimes what we call family is just familiarity, and familiarity is a sedative. A slowly administered drip of this is just how things are, until you wake up one morning and realize you've been anesthetized out of your own agency. I remember walking into a small bookstore by the boardwalk, a secondhand place with dusty corners and handwritten genre labels. The owner looked like he'd survived 3 revolutions and a fire. I asked him how long he'd been here. "Long enough to lose everything once," he said with a shrug, "and rebuild it exactly how I wanted." That line stayed with me, because that's what I was doing. Losing the version of me my family had built like scaffolding, and rebuilding it with brick. With fireproofing, with my name etched in the cornerstone. That night, I opened a notebook and wrote one line. "I will never again explain my boundaries to people who benefit from breaking them." By Wednesday, the tone shifted. My aunt called, the one who always played diplomat when things got too dramatics. I let it go to voicemail. "Your parents are upset. Olivia, Rachel's been crying. This is hurting the family." Funny how the moment you protect your peace, it's called hurting the family. But when they erase your needs, your space, your voice that's just love, right? I didn't respond. I walked instead, through old streets I hadn't seen in years, past parks where I used to read on lunch breaks, past the art gallery where Rachel once had a showing funded by our parents, where I stood in the back with a bouquet she didn't even acknowledge. I walked like a woman reclaiming footsteps, and with each block, I remembered something steelier than guilt, dignity, the thing they never quite taught me, because I was raised to please, not to protect. To endure, not to enforce. But dignity doesn't come wrapped in approval. It comes when you can sit in a storm of disapproval and still not move your chair. By Friday, the messages slowed. A final one from my father. "We're moving Rachel back in with us. Hope this stunt was worth it." That word, stunt, to him, my refusal was theater. Performance, because to those who benefit from your compliance, your resistance will always look like rebellion. I saved the message, not for revenge, but as a monument, a reminder of the final time someone tried to dictate my life like a chessboard without realizing the queen had already left the game. That night, I opened my laptop, typed a single email to building management. Derek's occupancy ends this Sunday. I'll be returning home Monday. Thank you for your support. And with that, I stepped back into ownership. Not just of the space, but of myself. I returned on a Monday. No fanfare. No announcement. Just the sound of keys in a lock, the soft hum of city noise outside the windows, and the familiar scent of my eucalyptus candle slightly used. Still strong, Derek had left the place spotless. Books back in place, dishes done, couch pillows fluffed the exact way I liked them. Not because I asked, but because he understood what it meant to live somewhere that finally feels like yours. A yellow Post-it note was stuck to the fridge. It's good to see someone claim what they built. D, no sermon, no sympathy. Just truth, quiet and warm, like sunlight returning to a cold room. I ran my hand along the wall as I walked through, touching it like skin I hadn't worn in weeks. Everything looked the same, but it felt different. Or maybe I did. This was no longer a space I lived in. It was a testament to boundaries enforced, to dignity earned, to silence reclaimed as something sacred, not empty. I poured tea, sat on the couch, listened to nothing, and for the first time since childhood, I felt what peace sounds like. Not the performance of peace, the one where you smile through gritted teeth at family dinners and pretend passive aggression is just concern. No, this was deeper. This was peace that didn't ask for proof. That didn't barter with guilt. That simply existed because I chose it. And that night, when I slept, there were no dreams of confrontation. Only space, stillness. My breath in my own rhythm. They didn't reach out for a while. It was as if my silence created a vacuum none of them wanted to fill. Too afraid of what would echo back. But eventually, like clockwork, it came, a single message from my father. Let's talk. No anger, no accusation, but no apology either. Just the implication that enough time had passed, and things should now return to normal. But normal had been the cage, and I wasn't going back in. Still, I agreed to meet not out of obligation, but to complete the cycle. You can't always burn bridges. Sometimes you have to walk across them, just to see who follows you to the other side. We met at a cafe halfway between my apartment and their home. Public enough to ensure restraint. Quiet enough for things to be said. He arrived in his usual uniform blazer. Collared shirt. Watch that ticked louder than his empathy ever had. He didn't hug me. He never really did. He just sat down and looked at me like he was trying to remember the last time I'd challenged him. Like I had somehow stepped out of my designated frame. And for the first time, I didn't shrink to fit it again. I want to understand, he said finally. And maybe he did, but the old me would have bent that olive branch into a bridge. The new me, I sat with it, let it be awkward. Because discomfort is where change begins. I built that apartment with years of sacrifice. I said, slow, measured, and you all decided without asking to give it away, like it was a tool in someone else's recovery. He blinked. Not in shock, but because he didn't yet know the weight of what he'd done. I didn't think it would be such a big deal. He admitted, and that was the problem. He didn't think. He assumed, he planned. He declared, like a general drafting a war strategy without consulting the soldiers who would bleed for it. And I was done bleeding. I've never asked for much, I continued. Never needed you to fund my dreams or clean up my messes. I just wanted what I earned to be mine. And instead of recognizing that, you treated it like community property. He looked away. I was trying to help your sister, he said. I know, I replied, but you helped her at my expense. That's not generosity. That's theft dressed in good intentions. He didn't have a response, not because he was cruel, but because he had never had to consider that maybe the strong one, the quiet one, was breaking. 2. Rachel eventually reached out. Not through our parents, not through drama, just a text. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Can we talk? I waited 3 days, not as punishment, but as pause, because sometimes forgiveness given too quickly becomes permission. We met at a diner, the kind we used to stop at after school when our mom worked late. Cheap booths, greasy eggs, memories tangled in every corner. She looked tired, not theatrically so, just tired from realizing that safety nets fray. I didn't know they hadn't asked you. She began. They said you were fine with it. I should have called. I nodded. It wasn't just about the apartment, I told her. It was about the assumption that I would bend, that I didn't matter in the equation. She wiped her eyes. They always made it seem like you were just stable, unshakable, like nothing got to you. I smiled, not cruelly, just sadly. That's what survival looks like. Rachel, doesn't mean it's soft inside. We sat in silence for a bit. Not uncomfortable, just honest. And when we left, I didn't promise her anything, but I hugged her. And that, in our family, was louder than any forgiveness ever spoken aloud. There is something holy about reclaiming what was once taken for granted. My apartment felt different now, not just because I'd stood up for it, but because I had seen myself in it for the first time. I repainted the office, not to erase the memory of what almost happened, but to seal it, like lacquer over scarred wood. Because I don't believe in forgetting. I believe in preserving lessons in plain sight. That office became my sanctuary. My launchpad, where I wrote stories that no one interrupted, created projects no one repurposed, made decisions no one rescripted. And sometimes, in the quietest hours before dawn, I would sit by the window and sip my tea, grateful not just that I had left, but that I had returned whole. Because you don't need revenge to prove your worth. You just need the kind of stillness that speaks louder than protest. The kind of self-possession that whispers, I'm not here to argue anymore. I'm here to exist fully. Peace doesn't come wrapped in applause. It comes in unreturned calls that no longer bother you. It comes when the silence after I'm sorry doesn't require you to say, it's okay. Because sometimes it's not okay. And sometimes healing means not pretending it is. In the months that followed my return, things didn't magically resolve. The air at family dinners still hung heavier than usual. Conversations tiptoed around certain memories like they were live wires. My mother would sometimes trail off mid-sentence when referring to that week, as if giving it a name would summon the storm all over again. But I didn't flinch. I let her sentence dangle. Because some things don't need to be rescued. Some silences should be left untouched, not as punishment, but as preservation. Like sealing the edge of a page you no longer reread. The funny thing about boundaries is that once you build them, you begin to notice how many places in your life were leaking your power. How many conversations were based on performance. How often you apologized for being inconvenienced. And most of all, how hard you worked just to maintain someone else's comfort while suffocating your own. I started cutting smaller cords first. Stopped answering messages that came with guilt instead of grace. Stopped explaining why I said no. Stopped making myself available for emotional cleanup duty every time someone else dropped the ball. And in that new clarity, I didn't just find freedom. I found myself. That fall, I started therapy again. Not crisis therapy, not emergency intervention, but the kind of therapy you go to after you've stopped bleeding to understand the scar. My therapist was a woman named Elena, mid-40s. Soft-spoken, but piercing. The kind of presence that made you feel like nothing you said would be too much, and nothing you hid would stay hidden for long. On our second session, she asked, when did you learn it was your job to hold everything together? The question landed so hard I laughed. Because the truth was, I couldn't remember not knowing that. Ever since I was old enough to read a room, I had read it like scripture, anticipating disappointment, preparing explanations, sanding down the edges of my own needs to avoid conflict. But that's the trick of families like mine. They convince you that peace equals silence, that love equals sacrifice, that obedience equals virtue, until one day, you're standing in the wreckage of your own unspoken dreams, being praised for how well you handled everything that should have never been yours to carry. I looked at Elena and said, I think they mistook my silence for strength. And she nodded. Maybe you gave them the silence because it was the only power you had left. I started writing again that winter. Not just journals, but real stories, essays, letters to myself, truths I had never spoken aloud. I wrote about the night they tried to give away my home, like it was an extension of their grace. I wrote about the day I stood still while they shouted through a locked door, and how that stillness was the loudest thing I'd ever done. And slowly, those pages stopped being about revenge. They became about reclamation. Because true revenge is not destruction, it's creation. It's building the thing they told you would never exist without them, and then inviting no one to the ribbon cutting. One evening, as snow began falling soft and silent outside my window, Rachel called, not to ask for anything, not to reopen old wounds. She just said, "Can I come over?" And for the first time in years, I said yes, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. She arrived wearing a beanie, cheeks red from the cold, arms wrapped around a thermos of tea, like a child trying to warm their regrets. She walked into my apartment like it was a museum. Quiet, careful, reverent, and then ashaw idimibis. Just before she sat down, she whispered, "I don't think I ever understood what this place meant to you." I poured her tea, sat beside her, and said, "Most people don't see the temple when they weren't around for the building." She looked down, bit her lip. I was spoiled. They cleaned up all my messes, paid for all my relapses. But you did this on your own. I didn't interrupt her, didn't rush her confession. Because healing isn't fast food, it's a slow simmer. She looked at the window, where snow painted everything in white forgiveness. I started therapy. Because of you, that sentence hit harder than any apology. Because while sorry is nice, change is sacred. By spring, my family had changed slightly, imperfectly. My mother still texted too much. My father still pretended that winter never happened. But something had shifted. They started asking, "Would you like to host dinner? Are you free this weekend? Can we talk about something that might affect you?" Small things. But in families like mine, small things are revolutions. I wasn't looking for perfection. I was looking for respect. And I had finally taught them how to offer it, not with sermons, not with tears, but with silence, distance, and unshakable dignity. Edison didn't invent the light bulb in one spark. He failed over 10, 0 times. But when he finally got it right, the world changed. Not because he was brilliant, but because he was relentless. And me? I failed at boundaries for years. Folded at the first sign of guilt. Bent every time love came, dressed as pressure. But the day I disappeared on moving day, that was my invention. The first time I lit up a dark room and said, "You don't get to live here unless you knock." And now the light stays on. For me, for the woman I'm still becoming. For the peace I no longer apologize for. There's something strange that happens when you finally choose yourself. At first, it feels wrong, like wearing someone else's coat warm. But unfamiliar, you look in the mirror and barely recognize the woman standing there. Not because she's a stranger, but because she's who you were before the world asked you to shrink. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to grow back into your own skin. That spring, I didn't become someone new. I became someone undeniable. I started working differently. Not longer hours, just cleaner ones, clearer ones. I stopped volunteering for tasks no one asked for, but everyone expected. Stopped apologizing in emails for taking time off I'd earned. I reclaimed my calendar like it was sacred ground. Because boundaries, I'd come to learn, weren't walls. They were doors with locks I controlled. My boss once asked in a meeting why I'd become more direct. I smiled and replied, "Because indirectness is a tax on women's time. I'm done paying." There was a pause, then nods. Real ones, the kind that happen when you stop translating your power into politeness and start speaking fluently in self-worth. Even my apartment began to reflect the change. I bought a new desk, not because I needed it, but because I deserved one that didn't wobble when I typed. I replaced the couch that had absorbed years of exhaustion with one that invited rest, not collapse. I framed a quote above my desk, not a cliche, but a mantra. Just because they're used to having access doesn't mean they're entitled to it. It reminded me every morning that I was not a hallway for other people's emergencies. I was a home, a temple, a locked gate with a key only I held. There were still hard moments, Like the time my mother hinted that maybe we were losing touch as a family. Or when my father asked, during one quiet Sunday lunch, if I ever planned on rejoining the fold. They meant well, but even well-meaning people can be architects of your exhaustion. I looked at them both, calm and steady, and said, I didn't leave the family. I just left the roles you assigned me. No one spoke for a long time, because there's a grief that comes with truth. But sometimes, grief is just the clearing out before regrowth. Rachel changed. Too, not all at once. But enough. She got a job that wasn't romantic or glamorous, but stable, showed up every day, paid her own bills, moved out of our parents' house in the middle of July, and into a studio that smelled like pine and new beginnings. We met once a week for tea. She started asking questions, not just about me, but about herself. Why she'd always fallen apart when things got hard. Why she used charm as currency. Why she needed other people's attention to believe in her own value. And I realized then, sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't just free you. It gives someone else permission to free themselves. I think about my younger self sometimes. The girl who stood at the family dinner table, wine in hand, listening to her parents plan her home away like it was a family heirloom to be passed down. I wish I could touch her shoulder, press my forehead to hers, and say, you're not crazy. You're not selfish. You're not wrong. They just got used to a version of you that was convenient. But you're allowed to be inconvenient when you're protecting your peace. And if she cried, I'd let her, but not for long. Because the world is waiting for her to rise, not with vengeance, but with vision, and she does. Because I did. One day in late summer, I stood on my apartment balcony, watching the sun slip behind the buildings. The light caught the window just right, and for a second, I saw myself reflected in the glass. Not just standing, rooted, not just surviving, thriving. And I thought of all the women who'd walked before me who'd said no. Not with fury, but with finality. The women who locked their doors and never apologized. The ones who chose solitude over subjugation. The ones who left quietly and came back as queens. Because that's what I was now. Not royalty by blood, but royalty by rebirth. They planned my life without me, so I disappeared. Not to vanish, but to return on my own terms, in my own name. And in a silence so loud it could not be ignored. And the door, it's still locked. But I'm standing behind it now, smiling. Because the only people who are welcome inside are the ones who remember to knock. I don't know the exact moment I became unrecognizable to them. Maybe it was when I stopped asking for permission. Maybe it was when I stopped answering texts that dripped with guilt. Maybe it was when I stopped explaining and just began existing. But somewhere between the locked door and the silence that followed, they stopped looking for the girl they could persuade. And I stopped waiting for them to understand the woman I was becoming. Because becoming real becoming is a departure. Not from people, from pattern. One Sunday morning, I walked to the market just as the city was waking up. The air was cool, my breath visible, and as I passed the bookstore, I saw a young woman standing outside, maybe 24, maybe less, arguing on the phone. She had the look, that quiet fury, that breath-catching between tears expression of someone being asked again to sacrifice a piece of herself for someone else's comfort. I didn't know her story, but I knew her shape. The outline of a woman who has always been reliable, accommodating, good. The kind of woman families depend on and forget to protect. And I wanted to say something to her, anything, but instead, I just smiled. A small, knowing curve of the lips that says, you're not crazy. You're just waking up. And that's enough sometimes. A witness, a mirror, a whisper from someone who's already walked through the fire and come out radiant on the other side. When I got home, I lit a candle and stood barefoot in my kitchen. I looked around at the shelves I'd filled one book at a time, the couch where I'd cried and healed, the window that held every sunset of the past 2 years. And I realized something, they hadn't taken anything from me. Not really. Because you can't steal what you don't understand. They had tried to rearrange my life without me, tried to name my future like it was theirs to title. But this was the story I got to write. And every page since then had been penned in ink they could no longer touch. Months later, we sat down again, all of us. Family dinner. Real this time. No announcements, no plans. Just food and time and the awkward rhythm of a family trying to recalibrate. And my mother, somewhere between the potatoes and the pie, said it, "You taught us something this year, Olivia." Everyone looked up. "You reminded us that love without respect isn't love, and help that ignores consent is control." She didn't cry. Neither did I, but we both blinked too much for it to be casual. My father cleared his throat. "You held your ground, and honestly, I didn't think you would." That line, it could have broken me a year ago. Now it just confirmed what I already knew. That the strongest moves are made when no one's watching. That leaving quietly is louder than any door slam. Rachel leaned over to refill my glass. "You scared the hell out of me." "You know." I smirked. "Good." She laughed. A real laugh. The kind that says, "We're sisters again, but on equal footing now." Later that night, walking back to my apartment, I realized I no longer flinched at the idea of home. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a beacon. And I was no longer just surviving it. I was shaping it. There's a myth that says if you love people, you'll always say yes. But the truth is, if you really love them and yourself, you'll say no when it matters. Because love isn't obedience. Love isn't silence. Love isn't sacrifice masquerading as loyalty. Love is what happens when both people feel safe enough to say, "This is mine," and still be met with grace. And so, to anyone who's ever stood at the edge of their own boundaries, to the woman about to bite her tongue again, to the man rehearsing how to make a no sound soft enough not to offend, to the middle child, the fixer, the overachiever, the peacemaker, let me say this, they'll call you selfish, cold, dramatic, overreacting. But that's only because your boundaries are disrupting their benefits. Keep going anyway. Disappear if that's what it takes to be heard. Lock the door if they won't knock. Reclaim the space even if your hands shake. Because you are not selfish. You are sovereign, and one day, when the dust settles, when the calls go quiet, when you're finally able to sit in your own stillness, you will realize something profound. The people who truly love you will adapt. The ones who only loved your silence will fade. And you will remain, not because you fought harder, but because you finally stopped fighting to be understood and started living to be whole. That day, they planned my life without me. It wasn't the end. It was the moment I discovered I didn't need their permission to begin. And the woman who disappeared, she never really left. She just stepped out long enough to remember who she was, before they rewrote her name. Now she walks differently, speaks carefully, loves fully, and opens the door, only when she decides who's worthy of coming in.